Welcome to the Outthinkers Podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists, innovators, and entrepreneurs that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
So, given the dramatic demonstrations of the cognitive shortcomings of human judgment documented over years, go to Wikipedia and say, cognitive biases and look at the 200 examples of cognitive bias that have so far been collected. So my notion is that the best role for AI is compensatory intelligence, building a system that shows our understanding of our own weakness. And you can see there's a coherence in each of these arguments. Be humble and acknowledge the fact that we could use a little bit of advice.
That was Russ Neuman, professor of media technology at New York University, a founding faculty member of the MIT Media Lab, and he served as senior policy analyst in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. When I first came across his work, it spoke to me at a deep level. It echoed what my father had been telling me for his entire career, and it didn't realize exactly why until we figured out that he actually was a colleague of my father at the University of Pennsylvania for many years. His books like The Digital Difference, Media Technology and the Theory of Communication Effects, and his most recent book, Evolutionary Intelligence, How Technology Will Make Us Smarter, are rooted in the view that human intelligence and human communication are intertwined. We think together through language, through communication. And what this means is that human intelligence has evolved since the dawn of man as our communication technologies have evolved. As you heard in the highlighted clip, this insight gives us a very interesting glimpse at how human intelligence may next evolve as AI comes into play. In this podcast, we discuss the definition of intelligence at its fundamental roots and how human intelligence is similar to or different from machine intelligence. How human intelligence has evolved as our forms of communication have evolved, and what this insight can tell us about the next stage of human intelligence in the era of AI. Why machines and AI aren't going to replace human intelligence, but rather converge with it and complement it. Think compensating for human cognitive biases and weaknesses, not taking us over. The future of intelligence as we know it, and how we are really in what Russ calls the revolutionary intelligence era. Ladies and gentlemen, Russ Neuman. Russ, it is great to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for being here. I have loved reading your book, and I'm excited to dive into it. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So I'd like to warm us up, and I'll say for the audience that we indirectly know each other because you taught with my father at the University of Pennsylvania, and both have sat and thought a lot about this interface between machine and human communication. I'd like to start off by just getting to know you a little bit personally and ask you to complete the sentence for me. If you know me, you know that.
I am a curious being, and that I welcome your questions. And I welcome when you challenge me, because that's a lot more fun than just agreeing with me.
Okay, I'll try to do that. It seems like you've thought many layers deep into your arguments, but I'll challenge you to dig a little bit. This is a podcast for strategists as well as entrepreneurs are shaping the future. You think a lot about strategy, maybe is about decision making. You think a lot about human and machine decision making. What's your definition of strategy?
My definition of strategy is recognizing that you're wrong and open to the question of how wrong you are this time.
I like that. Explain that. You're always wrong, and the question is, how wrong are you this time? So there's no perfect answers.
You basically argued that many of the strategists with whom you interact are humble. And you need to persuade me of that, because most of the folks in strategy pick a particular strategic approach and then they become advocates for that approach. And my view is that advocacy has to be highly conditional. And the best strategists are saying, this is my strategy. And as conditions change, you're going to watch my strategy change very quickly. And rather than being an advocate for a strategy, I'm an advocate for adjusting the strategy to the changing conditions.
I'd love to just open up just with the premise of the book so that people can understand what that means. What's your definition of intelligence?
My definition of intelligence is acting in a way that is thoughtfully responsive to the conditions around you so that you can achieve your goals. Evolutionary intelligence is a recognition that human beings, talk about being humble, are slow, naked, not very fast, and therefore what in fact gives us the capacity to survive when many of the other species with whom we have competed have become extinct is that we are adaptable. We change quickly and appropriately in response to the circumstances. So our capacity to clothe ourselves helped the invention of the wheel, and ultimately the invention of machines meant that even though we weren't very strong, we were able to harness the energy of these machines. And so the kind of the definition of human survival is the capacity to adjust its environment to enhance our, not only our survival, but our thriving and successfully enjoying and taking advantage of our environment. And finally, and importantly, and that's the key issue we deal with in the book, Evolutionary Intelligence, we've now confronted a technology that's going to make us smarter. And evolutionary intelligence is recognizing that this has a very unique character because rather than just making us stronger or faster or able to communicate over long distances because we figured out what radio waves are, it's a really important opportunity, which is what leads me to this relatively positive position I take relative to the others in the AI field who are very fretful and worried and concerned and want to put on brakes and guardrails and hold back and maybe even stop. The key issue here for me to define AI distinctly from my colleagues is that they say, well, what we want is AGI, which is a commonly used acronym for artificial general intelligence. And what they really mean is human intelligence. And that, I think, is a critical mistake. And it's, again, more hubris and lack of humility. My personal view is it ain't. And so, given the dramatic demonstrations of the cognitive shortcomings of human judgment documented over years, I mean, go to Wikipedia and say, cognitive biases and look at the 200 examples of cognitive bias that have so far been collected in Wikipedia. So my notion is that the best role for AI is compensatory intelligence, building a system that shows our understanding of our own weakness. And you can see there's a coherence in each of these arguments. Be humble and acknowledge the fact that we could use a little bit of advice.
Yeah, we could use a little help. We're not the optimal decision makers. I want to get to this moment that you're pointing to is already underway, but when I opened your book, I immediately I started with chapter 5. If you could walk back and put this into the historical context, you talk about language, land, leverage, and literacy as 4 kind of leaps in human evolution, and they all correlate. Well, they seem to all correlate with communication or communication speed. Could you just describe those stages?
Human beings are a recent evolutionary development. Anthropologists and biologists argue a bit about what you would consider the start of modern humans. My rough definition, this is sort of fun to talk about, is if you gave a humanoid from 500,000 years ago a shave and a haircut, put a nice suit on them, they would be, and then walk down Walnut Street in Philadelphia, they'd be recognized, well, that's just another human being walking down. So that they looked close enough to and probably act close enough to us. So I figure maybe 400, 500,000 years, modern humans have existed. And over that period, given that much of what came up to that was the shared evolutionary impulses and instincts, sexual and towards violence, that we shared with our primate ancestors. So we're there for 400,000 years, and we don't know when language started. We assume that for the first 200,000 years, Ken, you and I talking to each other back then would have been mostly gestures, grunts, making sounds like various animals and weather events, and maybe a few words that would be nouns, but I'm not sure we quite comprehended verbs yet. So let's say maybe 100,000 years ago, we had language. And that gave us the capacity to communicate. And the other element of human adaptability that allows us to survive is collaborative hunting, cooperation. So one of the reasons humans are very sensitive to fashion and what other people think about us was that was central to survival. Because if the animals we wanted to kill were bigger than us, stronger than us, faster than us, unless we could collaborate and then use tools as well, we were likely to be struck to grabbing a few tubers out of the ground, a few berries, and maybe a few small animals. So if you think about it, it was tough back then. And it's fun to think about that, the great majority of evolutionary years, we weren't yet dealing with any kind of technology, maybe stones a little bit later. So language comes first. And then when did we start settling in? I mean, basically, we were hunters and gatherers. And the question is, well, how long ago, after 400,000 years, how long ago do we settle in settlements? And the answer is 10,000 years ago. Very recently, that we figured out we probably chased some animals into a canyon and that figured out how to keep them to stay there, and figured we could actually plant a few plants rather than just picking up the berries wherever we could find them. We said, hey, this is neat. And it turned out that this same transition happened after the receding of the most recent ice age, that we figured out how to plant and maintain and water things. So we started living together in smaller communities, not just as small families hunting and gathering. And as we gathered together, we started to organize ourselves, ultimately to build armies. And about this time, maybe 6,000 years later, we started to develop writing. But for the bulk of the following years, only the elites had access to reading and writing. It was still a kind of a common language. So we had communications, but not yet writing. So writing and communications, you're absolutely right, became increasingly important for our capacity to coordinate and work with each other. And so each of these technologies makes a big difference. Then comes the leverage of the Industrial Revolution. And in each one of these transitions was difficult and delicate, and mistakes were made. If you think about the Industrial Revolution that gives us the capacity for everything we take it for granted today, during the early days of the Industrial Revolution, the transition from the sailboat and the windmill, the early cities were ugly and the working conditions were awful. It took us a while to figure out how to live with these technologies without them kind of overwhelming us. And my view is that now that we've discovered the next major evolutionary transition, not just machines, but intelligent machines, we're going to make a few mistakes as well. And hopefully they will not be existentially challenging.
And then literacy comes after that.
It's ironic that we learned to write maybe 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years is probably the Sumerians were the first. And the average individual on the globe, being the average, family member being able to read and write, is probably about 100 years, well into the Industrial Revolution, when mass education became available.
So when did we realize we were in the Industrial Revolution?
I got fascinated. Our colleague Dan Bell at Harvard, a brilliant sociologist, just made this note in passing, introducing a book he was writing a preface for. And he said, by the way, we were 100 years into the Industrial Revolution before anybody actually used the term Industrial Revolution. So the notion that we don't fully understand the changes around us, we misperceive them. We say, well, I understand what a railroad is. I know what a steamboat is. But understanding that we're going through this massive revolution where machines will replace human and animal power took a while to understand its coherence. Now, I think that the digital revolution, when we moved from analog communications to digital, was recognized quite quickly. And you and I and our neighbors all share an instant recognition that there's something going on with the artificial intelligence revolution. So in those cases, I think the drama of what we've discovered, because especially it seems to be so human-like, we're paying attention to it immediately. And I think that's a very good thing.
So then the reason we call this the Outthinkers podcast, kind of the theory is to think out requires new language. If we can't solve a problem, then maybe we lack the word or language. And you kind of described now that Fourth Industrial Revolution is named 100 years later, and now we make sense. This is what's going on and how these relate to us. What do you call what we are experiencing now?
Evolutionary intelligence.
And can you define that for us?
Well, it's the conclusion, it's the recognition that what we've invented has such positive potential if we're not so fearful of it that we destroy it. If you think about the famous attribution of brilliance to Gutenberg and the printing press, it turns out that the printing press was invented 300 years before, both in China and in Korea, where the authorities said, I don't want that thing around. That's going to spread information that I can't control. So they wouldn't permit the printing press. So I'm delighted that we are doing the inventing that we're doing, and I'm hopeful that we'll see its positive potential and do the necessary nudging, steering, and correcting to get it to work positively for us.
Yes, that's what we want to go into next, kind of the positive and the potential negative, the dragons, as you call them, that we want to nudge away from. Sorry, but just because you talked about China, you have this great line that I heard you say, trying to regulate AI is like trying to nail Jello on the wall.
We haven't talked about the technical basis of AI. Let me briefly describe. The concept was invented in the mid 1950s by mathematicians and computer scientists. And for 70 years, they struggled to make it work. They had these, what are called now AI winters, when people wouldn't invest because it's not going to work. You're barking up the wrong tree. And it turns out three things were missing at the beginning to make these technologies work as intended. The first thing is we didn't have the computer power, which is now called cutely compute. I want more compute. I like that one. And the second thing was the appropriate mathematics to deal with these large models with literally billions of parameters. And the third was some data to train, sufficiently diverse data to train these complex models, which is now made available by the internet. And the combination of the compute power, the mathematical models, and the data, and nobody quite understood. And when they threw all that data and all that compute together, and it started talking at them in ways that were emergent and not exactly what they were trained on, but seemed to be making, I don't know, some kind of emergent thinking on their own, it literally scared the inventors. And so the whole notion that we don't fully and can't fully understand any model that has a million or a trillion parameters, but the human brain has somewhere around 100 billion neurons, and each of those neurons has multiple connections. So there's something like 1 trillion connections going on in the typical human brain. So we're now talking about technologies that are trying to understand the environment around us that are clearly almost as complex as the human brain.
Fascinating. So then how does that then interact? Because you also point out that our cognitive systems have not changed in 400,000 years. Just walk us through, I guess, kind of two questions I want to ask, and you can decide how you want to follow them. One is to walk us through your argument of what are the shortcomings of human cognition and how machines can help us address those. And what does it look like? What do you foresee human and machine collaborative thinking look like in the future?
So the promise, I think, of this concept of evolution where we use intelligent systems to compensate for our misunderstanding of the environment around us, based on the fact that, I could be wrong on this one, I think we understand pretty well what the cognitive biases are. So we are hopeful thinkers. We want to believe what reinforces what we already believe. We're resistant to changing our mind. And this is worth talking about a little bit. We're more, and this is something that strategists deal with among their colleagues all the time. We're more alert to the downside than the upside. We are genetically risk averse. And if you think about running around the jungle and you make a mistake about recognizing a predator, you die. You make a mistake and not see that a berry tree was there that you could have eaten. Well, you don't die. You just missed some calories. So it's in the interest of evolutionary human beings running around the jungles to say, be especially attuned to risk, especially existential risk. And so now it turns out that, well, you really want a balance between those two. And there's no reason that computers can't be programmed to try to come up with an estimate that says, what's the optimal mix of avoiding the downside and exploring the upside?
So just to help us visualize that, if you could walk us through a hypothetical scenario. So there's a strategist and they have to make an important decision, right? and they have to decide what they're going to approach. How does this AI, which you talk about being a compensatory partner, could you explain that dialogue just to help us illustrate it?
Okay, so the strategist is trying to sell an idea, and the audience for this strategist is skeptical. And what you want to do is say, okay, let's look at a dozen equivalent scenarios and say, under what, among those very different scenarios, will a strategy be successful? And if you can make the case that it's likely to be successful under 10 of the 12 scenarios, what the audience is doing is thinking about those two where it's not going to work, because they are thinking, I don't know, I see trouble here, and they're attracted to that. And so then, and it's a reasonable question to say, okay, what are the probabilities that each of those scenarios is likely to be the conditions that we're going to be working under in the near term future?
Got it. And then I guess when we look at the biases in the decision maker, so the strategist is trying to reach his or her confidence of a hypothesis, what the solution is. You talk about that there are these multiple biases that they may not be aware of: the commitment bias, the mood congruent memory bias, availability heuristic. And so what would that look like with this evolutionary intelligence coaching someone through those?
Okay, the availability bias is the fancy name for the classic joke about the drunk looking under the streetlight for his keys. He knows well that the keys were lost somewhere else, but the light is better under the streetlight. And we all laugh at how stupid. And I think we kind of characterize the person looking as a drunk, because what sane human being would look in the wrong place because the light is better with full knowledge that's not where the keys are anyway? And we all like that one. And the notion is that the assistant, maybe some version of Siri on your shoulder, says, hey, why don't you look a little farther over there and take out your damn cell phone and turn on the light?
Right. Love it. Great. And so, yeah, and for each of these biases, it can coach us like a good coach would. So let's talk a little bit about the potential downsides. You have this chapter, There Be Dragons. What are some of the scenarios, since we're talking about, that the humans gravitate towards protecting against the downside or the risk? What are some of the scenarios that we should be worried about?
So somebody's going to approach you over the next week or two and say, what's your P doom? Meaning the P paren doom, the probability that you think that AI is going to be an existential risk and kill us all. And people are asked that, and the numbers they come up with are a 0.1 or a 0.05. And there are doomers that are convinced that we've got a problem, the most famous of which is a gentleman named Eliezer Yudkowsky. When asked, what's your P doom? He says, yes. He's witty. And my concern, and there are many very thoughtful and very well-informed computer scientists that have a probability that these evolving AI systems will be existentially risky, is significant. And we should be talking with them, paying attention to them, taking their advice. But I think what they're doing is projecting human characteristics as humans grew up and evolved in the grasslands and the jungles again, competing with other humans and other species. They found that aggression and mistrust and a variety of behaviors were useful for survival. Computers didn't grow up in the grasslands and the jungles. Computers didn't wake up one morning and say, I want to eat your lunch. There's nothing in the evolution of computational intelligence that leads to that. So I think humans are simply dramatically projecting human characteristics onto computers that aren't there. Now, the reason I say there be dragons is that, well, there are malicious human beings with computer systems which have malicious intent and will try to design those systems for their own personal and malicious intent. And so, and I say this appropriately, apologetically, the one-liner I've come up with is that the best defense about a bad guy with an AI system is a good guy with an AI system. And I think we should come to appreciate the fact that when people are scared, those systems are very smart and they think very fast, faster than we do. And I'm saying we can design protective AI systems who are also very smart and can serve as very instantaneous, flexible, adaptable, protective systems.
Got it. That's brilliant. The idea that they didn't evolve in the jungles, that that kind of innate programming or conditioning is not human. I know we're reaching the top of our time with you. There are a couple additional questions I'd love to ask if I can steal a couple more minutes.
Certainly.
They're a little bit off the track here, but how do you see human machine communication evolving? You know, there's visual communication, there's auditory communication, there's tactile communication. How do you see that evolve?
Well, many people have observed this pattern. One of the terms I sometimes use to describe it is the convergence. Initially, computers were these gigantic rooms with air conditioning and vacuum tubes, and then they became refrigerator-sized computers, the DEC PDP-11s, and then they became desktops, then laptops, then handhelds, and increasingly they're going to be wearables, and we can imagine a smart glasses, maybe ultimately a smart contacts lens, so that the capacity to communicate with these systems becomes routine and part of our daily life. We protect ourselves from the environment by the clothes we wear, and I think increasingly that will be true by using intelligent systems. Think about it. Humans evolved with a capacity to see light and to hear sound, but humans have no capacity to perceive the radio waves that are in their environment. We're just missing that whole thing. Now, there are some birds and some fish that have capacity for magnetic and the perception of electricity. Now, virtually every human being on Earth has a sophisticated capacity to interpret the electromagnetic radiations of their environment. And so we walk into a store and we just electronically communicate our identity and our funds and come out with a latte with a flower on the top.
So, you know, what you're pointing to as well is I feel myself, I'm interacting more often with digital devices. And when we talk about the metaverse, I think people think of, you know, an artificial augmented reality visor. I know this is not a question that I have really properly formulated. I don't know that I haven't seen you write about it or think, or so I don't know if you have a response to it. But, you know, all of the sound and sight that we do see, it gets translated into electrical signals in our brain, and that's what we sense, right? So are we already digital beings?
No, we're already analog beings because the optic connection between your eyes and your brain sends electrical signals, electrochemical signals that are analog waveforms. And what you hear, your ears basically vibrate and send electrical signals representing the relative volume at different frequencies. And that's sent to the audio section of your brain that interprets those. So those are very analog signals. So your brain and the synapses reflect a very complicated analog form of electrochemical communications that is not ones and zeros. So there's a very distinctive difference between how the brain works and how the computers work. So you'll note that I've talked about various ways in which the current sensory systems of the human eyes and ears and sensitive to vibration can interpret through technology the environment. What I haven't talked about is direct connection to the brain. And as you may know, Elon Musk characteristically and several others are trying to say, well, what if we implant a chip inside the brain? Ray Kurzweil, among others, have talked about the physical convergence of digital and human analog intelligence and the biomechanical kind of convergence. I'm setting that one aside. I kind of find it icky. So I'll leave that to others to address. But I think there is such a rich capacity for us to use our current sensory capacities, where we use visual and auditory signals to enhance our capacity to intelligently respond to our environment. And the next time we say, gee, I think I'm going to buy a lottery ticket, Siri on our shoulder says, you're more likely to be hit by lightning 7 times than to win that lottery. And I go, well, maybe I could spend that money and invest in the market instead.
Got it. Got it. Yes. Yes. And what I love about your kind of description of this interaction between human machine is it's in this case, the machine is kind of guiding us and working with us. It's not dictating and controlling is your vision. I'm really sorry. I know I'm going to sneak in one more question. The very, very practical question that a lot of our strategy officers are contemplating. How many foundational models do you think there will ultimately be? Because we have a foundational model and then we can tune it with our own data, but how many will there be to build on?
Let's take as a very prominent and iconic model, GPT-4 by OpenAI. It took them $100 million, 100 days, 25,000 NVIDIA chips, each of them basically costing somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000 per chip. And I mean, you don't buy them, you rent them, I guess. What do you do with 25,000 chips after you're finished building your model?
After you're done. Right.
So
right.
You get people worried that only the big tech guys can possibly make this work. And it's not clear that OpenAI could have possibly gotten done what it has gotten done without very significant investments in the billions from Microsoft. That said, Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, has made it clear that he doesn't think that the next step is simply more chips, more data, and longer periods of collecting information. There are limits. It's not like Moore's law. There's limits because the costs get exponentially large and complicated when you just keep moving up. So the next stages of making these things better is probably going to be changing the algorithms that are used and changing the whole approach to how the algorithms are used, not just throwing more compute and more data at the same algorithms. So my guess is it's just a guess, but the answer is probably about a dozen foundational models. And that sounds like a lot of competition. Your colleagues may say, well, I'm guessing they're going to overinvest and that a dozen might make sense and might be sustainable. And given the fashion, the lemming fashion of Silicon Valley, maybe people end up investing and there'll be 24 and 1 dozen of them will go down the drain and the other dozen will have sufficient maintenance and updating. And just like data about human marketing, 2-year-old data about who's buying what isn't valuable at all. And a foundational model that hadn't been tuned for 2 years isn't going to be worth much. So my prediction is that the tuning and the updating is going to become really expensive. And we'll end up with something like a dozen foundational models, and each of them with 1,000 fine-tuned derivative API-based sons and daughters.
Got it. That makes sense. All right. I have so many more questions, but we've reached the top of our time with you. I want to know, how can people continue learning from you? We're certainly going to strongly suggest that people buy and read Evolutionary Intelligence, How Technology Will Make Us Smarter. You teach at NYU. You are associated with MIT Media Lab. You have a number of 2 videos and podcasts that I've listened to. What else can people do to follow you and continue to learn from you?
Basically, start with the book. It's a starting point. And I think it's one of those cases where you'll find a couple of ideas that you can pick up and run with. So I think that's an appropriate starting point. And the book is an attempt to make what would otherwise be a series of technical statements easily accessible to everybody.
I found it fascinating to read. It was like an exciting fiction that's actually true, opening up with Terminator 2 Judgment Day at the very beginning. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for sharing it with us here, Russ.
It was my pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you to our guest. Thank you to our executive producer, Karina Reyes, our editor, Zach Ness, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kyan Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you soon with another episode of Outthinkers.